Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to, and good morning to those who are in South Australia and Perth. Welcome to another RISSB Masterclass. My name is Sudha, and I'm part of the senior leadership team at RISSB, overseeing the products and data systems. I will be your host for this webinar. The presenter for this webinar is Amy Lizella, Chief Engineer, Rail Network Design and Integration from the Department of Transport and Planning, Victoria. Welcome, Amy. It's really nice to have you present at the Masterclass today. Amy will be discussing who's who in the zoo for Victorian Rail. She'll be giving an overview of the interaction between the Department of Transport and Planning, DTP, and the accredited rail transport operators, breaking down how Transport Integration Act, the Rail Safety National Law, and the Rail Safety National Law apply across different stakeholders, and the interaction around the various standards that they've got and how they interact. So she'll be going through that. Amy has been in rail since she graduated in 2007. In that time, she has worked in maintenance, design, and delivery. She started a career in materials and fire engineering, and she then worked in RAMS and through life engineering. Amy has been in engineering governance for over 5 years, bringing together her learned experiences. As a people leader, Amy focuses on enabling the individual to deliver for the team. Across her career, Amy has focused on a whole of life, whole of system view. She has a passion for sustainability and finding the balance for people, planet, and profit. Amy, it's an absolute pleasure to have you come and share and present at the RISSB webinar. What we will do is I'll hand it over to you now to do the presentation. And once you've done that, we'll come back for questions. Those of you who want to ask questions throughout the presentation, please put your notes or questions on the discussion comment sections of the Teams, and we'll pick them up. Just make sure that it's visible to everyone. So please be aware of that as you put those comments in. Over to you, Amy.
Thanks so much, Sudha, and yeah, thanks for having me back for another masterclass. It's a bit of a strange topic because it's not very technical in a way, but it's the topic I would have liked to have received when I started working in Victoria. Because in Victoria, we're a bit different to other states in how we're set up. And there's a lot of different stakeholders, which then leads to different ways that standards are put together and how we conduct waivers. So please do put any questions you have along the way in the chat. It's, like I said, it's a bit of a different presentation, but for me, I would have really appreciated this 8 years ago when I moved to Victoria. So first of all, the legislation which drives the way we behave here in Victoria, there's two key pieces of legislation. One of them I didn't actually hear about until I took on this role in 2022, which is the Victorian Transport Integration Act. The fact that I hadn't heard about it, I think now reflecting back, is quite interesting because it's not as well known as necessarily the Rail Safety National Law Act. So that one is more prevalent, as you'll learn to understand, because a lot more people engage with it, whereas the Victorian Transport Integration Act is very much related to the department. So these two pieces of legislation, they work side by side, and they also are brought up another piece of legislation, which I'll come on to, but they apply to different parties across the Victorian rail industry, and that is what then drives the way that we manage standards and the way that we manage waivers. So everything comes back to these two, and I'll take you through that journey. The Rail Safety National Law Act, I put in there, the original one was in South Australia in 2012. It was then adopted in Victoria in 2013 via the Rail Safety National Law Act. So there's some slight tweaks there for Victoria, but it's predominantly the same legislation as that was adopted in South Australia in 2012. As I said, there are other acts in Victoria which call upon these two. So the Development Victorian Act, which links to new infrastructure and new planning. There is the Major Transport Facilitation Act. There is the Rail Management Act, and there's the Suburban Rail Loop Act. So there's all these different pieces that fit together. The interesting thing about all four of these pieces of documentation is that all of them call upon these two pieces of legislation. So anything which is related to rail transport operator, it's as per defined in Rail Safety National Law, or the public transport system is as per defined in the Victorian Transport Integration Act. The role of head transport for Victoria, which I'll come on to, that is always detailed as per the Victorian Transport Integration Act. So these two pieces in the grey boxes, they are the leading pieces of legislation for what we do in the standards and waivers space, because it's always called back to, from these other pieces of legislation, it always calls back to these two. So these two very important pieces of legislation, what are they and why are they different? So the Victorian Transport Integration Act, which I'll call the TIA because that's what we refer it to. So this is what creates the new framework for provision of an integrated sustainable transport system in Victoria, and it's consistent with the vision statement. It effectively means that we can't just go and change the transport system as we wish. It needs to actually meet the vision statements within the Act. It makes sure that we spend the Victorian taxpayers' money in a sound way, and we build a transport system which is fit for the public. And it applies to all transport modes in Victoria. This isn't specific to rail, so it applies to roads, all public transport modes, active transport, it's all in there. It even interestingly covers things such as the CPA, so things like Uber, they're all caught up in there as well. Rail Safety National Law, as many people on this call will know, it is the law that's providing safe railway operation in Australia. It establishes the Office of the National Rail Safety Regulator, and it also establishes the process for accreditation of rail transport operators. So that's the one that most people in the rail industry know, and if you don't know about it, I highly recommend you go and have a look at it, because you are most likely affected by it and also liable under it, so you really should be across the content of the legislation. So the TIA, a little bit more detail, we're on version 83. So it's the entire transport network. We've got road, rail, bus, ports, ferries, active transport. The main things in there about the vision statement, the objectives, principles for the integration of the transport network. So it's from the Parliament, they recognise the aspirations of Victorians for an integrated and sustainable transport system that contributes to an inclusive, prosperous and environmentally responsible state. So the objectives are the social and economic inclusion, economic prosperity, environmental sustainability, integration of transport and land use. It's got to be efficient, coordinated, reliable, and we've got to promote safety, health and well-being. So a lot of items such as having an accessible network for those with additional accessibility needs, that is part of the Transport Integration Act that we need to be able to provide that. Obviously, there's other legislation associated with that one as well, but the obligations on us as members of the department comes through the Transport Integration Act. It talks a lot about transport planning, and also most interestingly, it talks about the minister, it talks about the department, the secretary, the head transport for Victoria. It also identifies the role of chief investigator for transport safety. So where in the rail industry, we've got ONSA, the rail safety regulator. For other transport modes, there is transport safety. So this calls up the legislation associated with that role and that function. The other items which are caught up in TIA is Safe Transport Victoria, again, similar to ONSA, and then the Victorian Rail Track Organisation, which is known as VicTrack to most people, and also V-Line. So these entities and their structure is caught up in the TIA. So if you ever want to understand V-Line and how it's set up, refer to the TIA, because that's where it calls it out as a government organisation and its purpose. Same with VicTrack. Rail Safety National Law, again, just covering that one, it's for the safe rail operations in Victoria, and the main part of it as well is the guiding principles, as mentioned before, is to call out the role of the regulator, establish the regulator. It talks about the duties and responsibilities of rail safety workers. As I mentioned, if you're on this call, you're most likely affected by the requirements in this legislation. If you're a designer, manufacturer, maintainer, supplier. It also sets out how to become an accredited operator and the accreditation process. So that's for people who are rail infrastructure managers or rolling stock operators, collectively known as RTOs, rail transport operators. The interesting thing about the Rail Safety National Law is it also sets out the ethos that the railway is set up, because we can't be 100% perfect and safe, because that's not how the railway works, but we can be safe so far as is reasonably practicable. But as part of that, so it sets out the definition of what reasonably practicable means. and how to, then there's obviously guidance for monitoring and how to assess it. But it also establishes, and this is the interesting piece that we need to be aware of, that it's what the person concerned knows or ought reasonably know. That is in the legislation, and it's something as designers in particular need to be aware of, because you need to be designing based on what you know or what you ought reasonably know in your role, and that is what you will be judged on. The other part of the Rail Safety National Law is the drug and alcohol testing. Obviously, we've got zero tolerance for drug and alcohol use when you're doing safe work on the railway, and also what it sets out in Rail Safety National Law is the testing methods that need to be used and which are acceptable. So two very different pieces of legislation, one applying to Victorian integration of transport, much more government department. Rail Safety National Law is national, but also sets out more for the operators. So who's who in the zoo? Again, this is what I really would have appreciated 8 years ago. First of all, let's talk a bit more about the department. The department, we've got a number of different services. We've now actually grown to be transport and planning. So we've got a lot of planning functions in there, which is working really well when it comes to the planning for the transport network. So planning obviously looks at things such as housing and general land use, not just the transport aspect, but having our planning colleagues closer is turning out to be very useful for particularly the rail space. So the objective of the department is to give effect to the vision statement and the objectives which are set out in the TIA. So we need an organisation to actually deliver on those. And that's where the Department of Transport Planning has been set up. The other two key roles set out in the TIA for the who's who in the zoo is the Secretary and the Head Transport for Victoria. It's actually the same person. So Paul Eunice is acting in both of these roles. He takes on both hats. They actually perform two different functions. So depending on whether he's in acting as the Secretary or acting as Head Transport Victoria, he's technically got two different hats on. The Secretary leads the department, provides advice to the Minister, it looks at the strategic planning and policies relating to the transport system, and it also liaises with other departments and agencies. So it's very much a departmental focus and very, supporting the Minister. Head Transport Victoria is very network focused. So it's to look at to coordinate and provide and maintain the vision for the public transport system, the road system, and to make sure we're delivering on the objectives under TIA. So one is departmental governmental focus, the other one is network focused. There is a whole detailed list of both of these roles in the Transport Integration Act. Again, if you have some time, have a read. It is, for those of you who like to read legislation, I find it quite interesting. It is a very interesting read to go through and see what the details are. For the wider Victoria network, this hopefully gives you some perspective of how complex it is. I know other states don't have this many players. It's very much more government-led. We in Victoria, we lease out our networks to other operators and pass that responsibility down. Under Rail Safety National, we can't fully pass off our duties, but the majority of the operational space we do pass down to other entities. There's also, I'll come on to the green boxes as well, because we've got some delivery authorities in there as well, just to add an extra layer of complexity. Victorian transport in the rail space, it all starts with VicTrack. VicTrack owns all of the assets. When you look at it from an accounting perspective, all of the assets sit on VicTrack's books. They then sublease, or they lease to the Department of Transport and Planning as the custodians of the assets, as the term that's been used, and then we sublease down to the relevant operators. So, for example, the Metropolitan Rail Network is sublet down to Metro Trains. The tram network is Yarra Trams. The regional network is V-Line. There is some national infrastructure, part of the ARTC's national network, which sits in Victoria, which is part of the Victorian Asset Group, which we then lease to ARTC. And then weirdly, we lease back to VicTrack some of the telecoms piece. And then up and coming in the future is Suburban Rail Loop. There'll be an RTO. So I've got both of them in there because they're going through the procurement phase to get the future operator on there. And in the interim, they're going to be acting as the RTO, Suburban Rail Loop themselves. And they will be operating the Suburban Rail Loop when that is built. Just to go back a little bit to VicTrack before I come on to the authorities. So this is off the VicTrack website. Again, you can see the complexity of the different subleases and tying back, just to give the context of how many stakeholders we have in different layers of commercial agreements we have in Victoria. So VicTrack at the very top, they have the holdings of the assets, they lease that to DTP, who lease it down either through franchise agreements or subleasing to the relevant operators. But then also VicTrack have a function as a telecom service provider, and they provide that service to the other operators. So coming back to this one, who's who in the zoo? The green boxes now, so we've got the Major Transport Infrastructure Authority, which will soon also be changing its name to the Victorian Infrastructure Delivery Authority, VIDA, and that's going to happen on the 22nd of April. I've kept it, that's what the asterisk is for, but I've kept it here as MTIA because it is currently still MTIA. They are responsible for delivering basic project management, setting up the contracts and closing out the contracts with the delivery agencies for major transport infrastructure. So that's both road and rail. When they move to VIDA, they're also going to be taking on health infrastructure as well. But currently it is just road and rail. So all of your metro tunnel projects, your level crossing projects, etc., they are in there. So the department sets out a client requirements document, hands it over to MTIA, who set up the project specification and technical requirements or equivalent documentation that then becomes part of the contract. And then they monitor the delivery of the project against that to then hand back the asset to the Department of Transport and Planning. So that's where MTIA is a delivery authority. They are focused on delivering projects. Hence, if you look back at the original set of legislation that I referred to, there is a development piece and a what's called now the major transport projects piece. I can't remember the exact name, but in that space, that's where MTIA sits. MTIA is actually an administrative arm of DTP. They don't have their own integration act, which is different to Suburban Rail Loop. Suburban Rail Loop do have their own act, so not operating under the TIA necessarily. However, at some point, it is expected the assets for Suburban Rail Loop will come under the Department of Transport and Planning. Therefore, we're working very closely with our colleagues in SRLA to ensure that what is being built is then going to tie in and will meet the objectives of the TIA. So Suburban Rail Loop have two integration acts that they're working under. They've got Suburban Rail Loop Act and our TIA, just to make it extra difficult for them. So looking at the TIA, it really does apply to the government entities. As I said, VicTrack is called out in the TIA. Department of Transport and Planning is responsible for delivering the TIA. MTIA, as an administrative arm of Department of Transport and Planning, has the TIA applying to it, as does Suburban Rail Loop, as the assets are expected to come back into Department of Transport and Planning in the future. Rail Safety National Law mostly applies to the group in blue, as the operators, because obviously they are accredited under Rail Safety National Law and they need to operate in line with their accreditation packs. However, as I mentioned, we can't fully delegate as the asset owners between VicTrack and Department of Transport and Planning. We can't fully delegate our responsibilities, so there are some accountabilities that apply to ourselves, but the majority of it does apply to Rail Safety National Law. Now, how does this link into standards? I'm going to take some water because I'm getting a bit dry. So standards has been an interesting journey in Victoria, particularly with the introduction of Rail Safety National Law and the ARTOs having their safety management systems as part of the accreditation. Under the safety management system, they each have their own engineering management system, which then each has a pack of standards. We used to have what's called VIROGs, Victorian Rail Industry Operating Group Standards, which was a set of standards contributed to by all of the operators, and it was owned by Head T4V, who's the owner under TIA. Head T4V does own all standards in Victoria. We delegate that down to the operators. It was a little bit complicated with VIROGs and the safety management systems, so there was a decision to separate out integration standards, which is very much high level network requirements, and the specific operation standards on operating requirements and more of the detail level. So that decision was made, and we actually then went to what we are today. So in the latest version of the standard framework rail, which ties all of this together, was released in 2018, and we're currently going through a refresh of that at the moment. So we end up with the network technical standards, also known as the NTS, which call out the very high level pieces such as, broad gauge on this network, loadings on that network, 1500 volt DC on that network, 650 volt on that network, all of these very high level requirements. We then go down into the detailed technical standards for each of the operations. So VLAN have some specific requirements, MTM have specific requirements, as do Yara. And they then form their engineering management system, safety management system to provide to answer and get accredited under Rail Safety National Law. So what this is then setting up, in theory, it works fantastically. We've been working with it for the last few years. We've noticed some issues, and I'll come on to what we're going to be doing in the future. But the reason we did that is because DTP, as the overall asset custodian, is integrating all of the networks as part of the Integration Act, whereas the operators are leading their operations under Rail Safety National Law. And we have those two pieces of legislation playing against each other and trying to work together, and that's how we've set up the current system. Under Standards Framework Rail, it talks about how to release documentation, whether it's an NTS or a technical standard from the operators. It also talks about the different waivers that we have if you have a non-compliance against the standards and how that works through the system. The other interesting piece as well, it talks about what is known as the Project Acceptance and Adoption Committee, also known as PAC. So for, again, MTIA delivering all of these major projects, if a new standard comes out, doesn't necessarily have to apply to that project depending on where they are in the life cycle. So there is an opportunity for the project to put forward a paper to say we actually don't want to take this on board. Depending on the importance of the requirements which are being updated, so if they are extremely safety critical, we do sometimes roll that out to live projects and say you must adopt this. For projects which are closing in the near future, even though it's an imperative requirement, they've lost the opportunity to implement that requirement. So that's why we have PAC, where they can actually say, we don't want to apply this. There's a lot more in Standards Framework Rail. Again, really useful piece of reading if you have the time and you're interested. We are updating it, as I mentioned, because it's 6 years old, and there's a lot of governance items which are out of date, particularly with governance forms of the DTP. So we're working on updating that. The other piece that I'll mention here is the engineering management framework that we're developing in DTP, of which this feeds into. It's currently in draft. It's going to be going to external consultation with our key stakeholders next week. And it then, with the aim of publishing at the end of the financial year. So you'll see that come out, hopefully in the next few months, everything going well. So moving to the future, what we've noticed is that between the NTS and the operator standards, there's sometimes a duplication of requirements, which can then lead to a contradiction in requirements if they're not updated at the same time. There's also an issue where we have operator standards which contradict each other. So, for example, platform heights between the VLine network and the MTM network, two different requirements in order to meet the disability access standard. However, we need to have shared platforms. So what do we do in that situation? So we've put together what's called the Transport Standards Task Force, also known as TST. It's a group of people within DTP who are leading it. However, we do have steercos and working groups with representation from each of the operators, because what we are aiming for is to have, first of all, a DTP database where we can store and administer all of the standards. Again, Transport Integration Act calls out head T4V as owner of all the transport standards. With the operators administering them, we have lost a little bit of visibility, and we want to bring that back into DTP. So that's one thing, is setting up the DTP database, but also cleaning up the level 1, level 2 requirements. So we're going to have level 1, level 2 standards, or it might end up being one document with level 1, level 2 requirements called out. We're still in development with that at the moment. As I said, this is future. But it will be level 1 requirements are those high-level integration pieces, and level 2 are the network-specific details. And bringing that to a much cleaner and traceable set of requirements. So that will all be called out within Standards Framework Rail, either V4 or V5, because there's some other areas that we need to update in V4, and depending on timing, but we are going to be updating the Standards Framework Rail to reflect much of this. which again will feed into the engineering management framework and DTP. What we're not changing is the engineering management systems for the ARTOs, because that is their obligations under rail safety national law. We're not touching those. What we're doing is we're doing a collaborative drafting of documentation, which will then be adopted into the individual engineering management systems, again, to reflect in the safety management system for their accreditation under rail safety national law. But hopefully this diagram shows you that there is always TIA and rail safety national law in play, and one of them applies to the department and the other one applies to the operators, and we're having to balance our obligations and work together with the operators to make sure that we're all delivering what we need to deliver and providing the governance around that, but also not blocking ourselves in or making it too difficult for industry. This is something, and I've put it at the bottom, very much proudly stole from MTN's document A1225, just to show you how the document hierarchy works together. So we've got the DTP documents, network technical standards, codes and practices, engineering directives where I feel the need. And then that feeds into the engineering standards. Obviously in the future, this will be level 1s, level 2s. We've got our standards, we've got specifications. Again, the chief engineers of the individual operators have the opportunity for engineering directives should they need them. And then we've got reference drawings as well. We've got standard drawings, which are called out within the standards. We've got typical drawings of typical arrangements on the network. And then we've got components for specific components, typically linked to type approvals. So they support the standards. But you can see on the left-hand side, we've got legislation and codes, not just the two that we're focusing on today, but other things, as I mentioned before, the disability access legislation, DSAT and DDA. We've got Energy Safe Victoria has legislation that we need to meet. And there's a number of others that all get captured within the standards. On the right-hand side, we've got international standards and Australian standards, and it would be remiss of me not to mention our host today. So any RISSB requirements or any RISSB documentation, that gets called up and adopted with either within the NTS or within the engineering standards for the RTOs and referred to directly as the whole. So what happens with all those complex levels of documentation? What happens with waivers? Well, we try and keep it as simple as possible. So where there is a technical non-compliance, if it is to what I will call the level 2 requirements, which is the operator level, you only need to do the operator waiver, and that's under their engineering management system. However, if it affects both the operator requirements and the integration requirements, it has to have both the RTO waiver and the DTP waiver. So we do a lot of work. Whenever someone submits a waiver to one of the RTOs, we do a lot of work to go through and have a read and just go, does this affect the NTS? Yes, no. If yes, then there's a dual waiver is needed. We're calling it a joint waiver at the moment because there was an ambition to have a single document signed by both entities. We've never quite managed to make that happen. Again, this is all getting captured in the update to the standards framework. So we do treat it currently as 2 separate waivers. The RTO waiver goes through their governance process under their safety management system. Our DTP waivers go through our governance process under the engineering management framework. They're heard at what's called the engineering review panel, which is actually at 1 o'clock today. So straight after this, I'm going into that, where we've got a number of waivers from industry coming forward against the NTS requirements. The reason why you have to do both, again, is because of the different responsibilities under the 2 different acts. So the ARTOs, they have their obligations under rail safety national law to deliver their safety management system. Under Transport Integration Act, I have obligations to make sure that we're meeting the integration requirements, of which are the NTS. So if we're straying from the NTS, we're not providing an integrated network. What does that mean? We need to understand that and see if we can accept that. That is all part of Transport Integration Act. So as designers, if anyone's on the call who's had to do 2 waivers for the same topic, we hear your frustration. Unfortunately, there are 2 sets of obligations that we're trying to meet. And the best way we can do that is by having these processes which are as similar as possible so that you can get them signed off. That is actually all from myself today. Hopefully that you found that informative and it's as useful as I found it putting together, and also from the learnings over the years of trying to piece the whole puzzle together. If you've got any questions, please do put them in the chat.
Thanks, Amy. Look, as I said to you earlier, I was really interested in really getting a framework in my head, as well as a standards organization, and very much interested in how it's structured. So it's hugely valuable and informative. I guess as questions come through, I've got a couple that I'm probably going to put out just to have a maybe we'll start with the waivers that you talked about. Are you able to provide us a bit of an example of a waiver that was kind of worked on, whether if you're able to share how kind of works in both sides, an example of a waiver that would work through those two aspects of the sides of the process? Yeah, you able to provide a bit of an example of how that will work out?
Gosh, I should be really prepared to answer this because, as I said, I'm about to hit 3 of them in my next meeting, but I've blanked that from my brain so I can focus on this. There are a few. I'm trying to think of a good one that I can talk to. There's ones, I won't be specific. There's the same topic has come up on 2 different projects, so I'll talk about that, but I won't say specifics. Sure. But there's a structural loading requirement that we have for the network. So we have to provide a certain amount of strength in our structures based on where you are, whether it's regional or metropolitan. There are 2 different projects that have had waivers within the last 6 months where we've been talking about this. And that's where you've got it on the operator network because it's their structures that they're managing, but also because it's an integration piece which allows for transition between different networks and also, for example, freight traveling on the networks, then we have requirements in the NTS as well. So that is one where you have to go both to the operator and to ourselves because it's operator specific for the structures that they are managing, but it's also an integration piece where it is traveling across multiple networks, and we need to make sure the various different rolling stock we have, whether it's regional rolling stock, metropolitan rolling stock, or freight rolling stock, this is obviously referring to heavy rail, not light rail, that is one that would need to come across. The other one that we've had from a light rail perspective is it's actually not a waiver, but it was a change to standard requirements. We had an overhead wire height. That is called out in both the NTS and the operator standard. So when we updated that to make it to increase the minimum wire height, we had to update both documents. And that's what I'm referring to, level 1s and level 2s. We should have that only called out in 1 space rather than the same number in 2 spaces, because that's how you can end up with contradictions. So then you could end up where you've got an operator started with 1 and the NTS with another, and you need a waiver to one of them because the numbers aren't aligned. And we want to avoid that. So that's part of the Transport Standards Task Force, is getting clarity about what is a level 1, what is a level 2, cleaning them up, and also introducing very clear traceability. So as a designer, you know, if you're not compliant to this one requirement, it then relates to this level 2 requirement, it then relates to a certain level 1 requirement, and you need to check the compliance for that as well.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you. That's really, really helpful in sort of highlighting that aspect of it. The other question I have is with regards to the Rail Safety National Law, and the RTOs are very much predominantly covered by the Rail Safety National Law. And then you've got the TIA, which covers a lot of the activities within the MTIA, SRLA, and Department of Transport and Planning. Currently, there's a review underway for Rail Safety National Law and duty holders, and largely the duty holders define relevant for RTOs and suppliers and all of that. Do you see, from your perspective, that whether some of the law also apply to under MTIA and Department of Transport and Planning, or do you see that as a clear separation? And if it is applicable, in what areas do you see it applicable?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, although we're not accredited under Rail Safety National Law, we can't fully delegate our duties because we still have a certain level of influence over the assets. So there are, it would be very surprised if anyone claimed that we were not culpable under Rail Safety National Law. We obviously would be, even though we're not accredited. The question is, as part of the update, does it mean that asset owners should be accredited? I know there are certain parties out there that would like to see that. So that's a change that I'm going to be closely watching to see what happens, because if that change to the law does come in, obviously that's going to have an impact on DTP. we're probably one of the only government entities in Australia that isn't accredited under rail safety national law, mainly because we're not an operator. So I know in New South Wales, Transport for New South Wales, and Sydney Metro, Sydney Trains, etc., they're all accredited, including Transport for New South Wales. So even though they're not technically the operator, they've also got accreditation. We don't do that in Victoria. There's pros and cons of both approaches. But yeah, I'm watching the legislation to see if that will be introduced, because obviously that will have a change to how we operate.
Yeah, thank you. Look, I think it's something that everyone will be watching what's going to change in the Rail Safety National Law, and I'm sure when the time comes, it'll be available for consultation, or there'll be a bit more detail coming through. And I guess from the duty holder side of stuff. But the other question I have is that obviously it's you got the levels of standards and perfectly put out on a diagram. We foresee a future change that's coming through the national federal work that NTC is doing on mandating standards and their structure. Can you sort of think about how that may possibly affect the structure that you're currently working towards? And have you guys taken into consideration the possible impact of the mandating standards coming into your framework that you're working towards from within Victoria?
Absolutely. We're not only just taking consideration, we're working very closely with our colleagues along, particularly on the eastern seaboard. Sorry for yourself, Suda, and others in Perth. But we're also working with NTC as well as part of the interoperability piece to understand what that will mean for, one, how do we help make it happen from a national perspective, but also what does that mean for ourselves in our framework? I don't think it's going to be too much of a change for us because we already do adopt Australian standards within our standards. So we call them out to apply them because currently, particularly RISSB standards, they're not mandatory. So we do have to specifically call them out to adopt them onto our networks. So I'm just going to, sorry, I need to go behind the screen. Just going back to this one here. So when we're talking about mandatory standards and if it's applied, I see it will just get caught up into here and then it'll get put in either to level 2 or level 1 requirements as the call out. But we already do call upon a lot of RISSB standards. And that's where I see if we can, get more alignment on what is the content of those and what are we applying nationally as the overall Australian requirements and get them into everyone's local standards. Absolutely, I'm very supportive of that so we can have some consistency and interoperability across the country.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to jump on a couple of questions that are coming through, so I'll read them out and so that you can focus on answering them.
And if I'm looking that way, it's because I can see the questions on this screen, but not on that.
Yeah, so that's fine. Look, I'll read them out. As the owner of the land upon which the railway is built, operate and maintain, what process do VicTrack have to follow before they sell land to developers? Shouldn't all VicTrack land be treated as a strategic asset and not be sold in order to safeguard and not limit future upgrades?
Yeah, and I'll have to pass you to my planning colleagues on that one because obviously there is land which is called out as rail land. What happens with it based on the overall Victorian plan is something which is much broader than myself and also DTP. I know there's a lot of discussion about actually having it called out in the future as rail land so we can safeguard it for future transport. But that's all discussions that are taking place and something that I'm not always privy to. So I would say there is an understanding of if we want to have future rail corridors, we need to protect that land. And as part of the business cases and the scoping of future projects, we do call that out. How that is then protected and looked after through the VicTrack in the planning space, that's something that's out of my remit. So unfortunately, I can't give you full details.
That's fine. As I read that out, I did think that maybe that may be beyond the scope of this conversation, but we can always try and see what additional information they can provide. There's a question in my field, track and civil requirements, NTS requirements around passenger ride comfort, for example, are drastically above and beyond those specified in the RTO standards. I'm not sure what the question around that is. I'm just going to move on.
No, well, I'm happy to elaborate on it. And yes, Jason,
Yep.
I do. Like that's why I mentioned there's some great things about the way we're working at the moment. There are some issues with how we're working at the moment, hence why the Transport Standards Task Force has been put together. One of the main things, as I mentioned, is to remove duplicated requirements or contradicting requirements, and to make sure there is a very clear traceability, and to make sure there's very clear alignment between level 1 and level 2 requirements. So that is, it sounds like an easy task to do. There is a huge amount of standards and a huge amount of requirements out there. It's a very large piece of work that the Transport Standards Task Force has to do. I will say, if you are supportive of that and you want to get the cleanup between the NTS and the operator standards going, please do flag it as something that you see as important to your leadership teams, because as I said, we've got representation from MTM and V-Line. It is, again, sorry, light rail, it's very heavy rail focused at the moment, because that's where most of the clashes are appearing. So yeah, for V-Line, for MTM, anyone who's working on the projects, do raise it to your leadership team that you want to support it, because the more support we get for it, the more funding we will get for it, and the sooner we can deliver it. So please do, make it known that you're interested in the outcome.
Brilliant. Thank you, Amy. Look, a slightly different question. Obviously, there are all these standards at different levels. How does DTP ensure compliance to NTS and level 1 or level 2 standards, and work with rail operators to achieve that outcome?
So very good question, because we don't have a team of detailed design reviewers in DTP. We're quite a lean engineering team. And this will be set out in the engineering management framework. A lot of the majority of our review is delegated down either to the delivery agencies, such as MTIA or Suburban Rail Loop. They do the design review in relation to contract compliance, so making sure the needs of the PSNTR and the CRD are met. And the operators, they do the review on our behalf for a whole of life view to make sure, as mentioned, the integration requirements and the operational outcomes that we want for the future network are being met. So there are reviews being done by the operators and also by the delivery agencies on our behalf. So we work closely with them to understand what is being accepted and what is being reviewed. And then the final say comes through, particularly when it's new infrastructure being added onto the network or new rolling stock being added onto the network. It comes through what we have is a network development review group. So compliance to the CRD is put forward as a paper at different stages. We've got different gates and different artifacts provided at those different gates, and we review those papers. So if we don't pick it up in the day-to-day interactions with the people design reviewing on our behalf, we pick it up as the summary paper at the different gates. That's all part of DTP's Network Integration Assurance Management Plan, NIRAM. And I know a lot about this at the moment because we are writing that engineering management framework, and all of this is being called up and set out so that it is, people can see it and understand it and how it all pieces together. As I said, we've got a lot of stakeholders that are doing lots of work out there, and we need to make sure it is all coordinated.
Thank you, Amy. I'll just read another one. Regarding the RTO changes to standards, are these being assessed by DTP for commercial implication prior to being approved, published, or is this being looked at downstream by delivery agents and alliances?
No, we do look at the commercial implications. So when a standard, again, this is in Standard Framework Rail, which I believe is a public document. If not, we can make it because it's available to all of the operators because they're involved. So under Standard Framework Rail, then it states in there that when a standard is to be released, if it's being drafted by the operators on DTP's behalf, as it will be if it's like the level 2 document, then it has to go through a governance process, because we do own all of the standards. So we need to make sure what is being released is in DTP's interest, both technically and commercially, because we don't want people either under delivering the the assets or over-delivering and gold plating. So when a standard is drafted, first of all, there's something called a standard change proposal document. So the operators can't actually go off and create standards or change standards as they see fit. They have to get permission to do any work and get paid to do that work on that standard. So we have to sign that off, first of all, in what's called the Standards Governance Group, which is a monthly meeting that I chair with each of the operators. And then we also, once that's been approved, they go off and do the work to the standard. They have to do all the consultation. It comes back. It goes to two different forums. First of all, it goes to the commercial. So whether it's V-Line, it go to their service level agreement governance group, or if it's the franchisees, Yarra and TM, it'll go to their governance groups. They assess it for impact to maintenance, impact to commercials, a lot of the non-technical aspect. They also have technical teams in there who do a bit of a technical review, but they're primarily looking at it from the commercial impact. And then it goes also at the same time to the SMEs who look at it to make sure they're okay with the technical piece. So when it comes to myself at the SGG, as part of the endorsement, we make sure it's been assessed from both commercial and technical before we release that standard to industry.
Thanks, Amy. Look, that brings us to another question, trying to balance this whole conversation of compliance that we talked about and all the structured systems. On a pure rail safety law point of view, in a core regulatory environment, operators do have the flexibility to innovate. And if you are a sort of a mining organization or whatever it is, they've got so much freedom to innovate and get into new technology very, very quickly. How do you see in this kind of structured environment? Do you see innovation as a easy way to get through? How does it work? And what is your personal sort of opinion on how innovation can sort of take place in this kind of structured environment?
There's lots of different ways about looking at the structure, whether it's the TIRL safety national law or the contractual structure, because I think they're two different things. From a TIRL safety national law, absolutely there's opportunity to innovate. Obviously, we need to work closely together to make sure that any products being used on the network meet the requirements, but that's very easily done through the type approval. I think probably the biggest barrier to innovation is probably more the contractual space and the return on investment. Who's funding it? Who's owning that innovation, and who's getting the money back for the innovation? Because obviously we're living in a fun capitalistic society, which means everyone wants to see what profit is going to be gained from that innovation. So we need to make sure there is a return on investment and the people making the investment are going to get that return. So it brings up lots of questions about whether is it a DTP funded or whether it's an operator funded. And if it's operator funded, how much time is left of the contract in order for them to get it back? Or is there a payback perspective? So I think the biggest barrier that I see currently for innovation on the networks is not actually the requirements and the legislation, that technical piece, it's the commercial frameworks and the commercial agreements. And we're working within those as much as we can to encourage innovation and improvements to the network. But obviously there's just some hard facts and reality about the way the contracts are set up. So we have to work within those frameworks, unfortunately.
Thanks, Amy. That's actually really a clear answer. And you look, obviously, innovation is a key topic at this particular point in time. Everyone is talking about it, and there are huge opportunities. And thank you for a very clear answer around that on what the key challenges are in that space. But a question here with regard to rail safety national law, what opportunity do government departments have to consult or understand interpretation directly as opposed to feedback through RTOs? Do you guys have a lot of sort of opportunity to kind of provide input and feedback in a rail safety national law review? I think that's probably what the question is.
I'm not too sure what they mean by understand interpretations. Is it interpretation of standards or interpretations of designs? I'm not too sure on that one because there'll be slightly different answers depending on interpretations. If it is interpretations of designs, we're implementing a new approach, which is to work closely to have a look at what reviews have taken place, to understand how people are interpreting requirements and as far as design acceptance is going. It's kind of doing a bit of a health check of interpretations to make sure those reviewing on our behalf are aligned to what our interpretation is. And obviously we work very closely with the ARTOs and the delivery agencies. So having those regular check-ins anyway, not necessarily the targeted ones, but just regular check-ins to make sure we are aligned and understand the intent of the requirements. That is something that we do generally at the moment anyway. So
brilliant. We've got another innovation question and new technologies with regards to current standards, considering
yes.
SRLA may develop their own. How is consistency maintained and similar to standards between MTM and V-Line?
So SRLA actually, where appropriate, calling out other operator standards, or where it's not appropriate, for example, where it's just very different system inherently, they're creating their own standards. That's part of our work as DTP and TIA, is to make sure that the network aligns as much as possible with the others. So because we don't really want to have orphaned assets out there, we're trying to, one, allow SRLA to be innovative and to create a brand new network for our state, whilst also making sure we're not doing something which is going to be totally isolated from the rest of the network. And it's a really hard balance to find. There is a lot of healthy tension sometimes between DTP and SRLA, but that's what we need to challenge each other. We're both holding, that's why we have those different hats on there, absolutely pushing the boundaries. I wouldn't say we're holding the boundaries back, but we are considering we've got to have these assets to be integrated into the wider transport network at some point in the future. So to add that layer of consideration to it, I think that's why we need that healthy tension to make sure we get the best outcome for the network. But yeah, with regards to innovation for the current standards, there is nothing really in the requirements that holds it back. If there is something that is innovative, that is good for the network, it can be applied. It's just got to go through the right process to get it assessed as not meeting the requirements and the reasons why. So that is all out there. There's the opportunity to do that. It just needs people to be able to look at it and invest in it and provide that justification. If we don't, we'll never move the assets forward. We're going to have to do that at some point. So I do encourage innovation. We've just got to make sure we govern that innovation properly. Very, bureaucratic response because, government employee, but we do need to make sure we govern that innovation properly to make sure that we've got the right assets on the network.
Thank you. Next one is understanding engineering waiver terminology and procedures across RTOs an area for improvement?
Depends what you mean by terminology. The waivers are typically set up because within DTP we mimic what the operators do under their safety management systems with regards to rail safety national law and looking at it from a SFART perspective. So I will say, yes, there is definitely areas of improvement in putting together a waiver, focusing on the SFART assessment and articulating that concisely within the waiver. That is the same for ARTOs as it is for DTP. If you're applying for one or the other, it's very much a similar approach and almost a copy paste. You're just going to make sure one of them looks at the whole network and one that looks at a specific network. But I would say if anybody is interested in improving the content of a waiver and improving the terminology or getting more awareness of the terminology, just research the ONSA guideline on SFARP, and that will give you some hints and guidelines on what is being sought for from a SFARP argument when putting a waiver forward.
Brilliant. I think we are running out of time soon. This will be the last question with regards to really the review work that DTP does, or even probably some of your delivery agencies do as far as standards are concerned. Rail Safety National Law has got very stringent consultation requirements. Does it apply to DTP from that perspective? And what level of consultation generally takes place with regards to standards writing and updates to standards here?
there is a lot of consultation that goes through. I know if anyone that's on the call has been dealt with the MTM station standard, I think there was 1,000 comments on that one. So yeah, there is a significant amount of consultation that takes place. We welcome that consultation. Obviously, we need to make changes to make sure it's suitable for industry. It's obviously just a lot more admin work that we have to go through, but it's something that I see as necessary to make sure we've got the right standard as the outcome. But yes, we do take consultation seriously. We do want to make sure we've got all the input from the relevant parties in industry. So if you do receive a standard that's been submitted for consultation, please do take the time to read it and provide those comments, because we do go line by line through every single one, and it takes time, but it's valuable work.
Thanks, Amy. Look, I know you started out by saying maybe this is a dry topic. It's obviously not the case. There's enough and more people interested in understanding this and discuss the intricacies of how it's structured in Victoria. And personally, from a RISSB perspective, absolutely very interested to learn more about this and have this conversation. So I just want to thank you for taking time to come and share what's happening in the world and who's who in the zoo in Victoria, and have this discussion with us today. So thank you very much, Amy, and thank you all for participating. If you got any further questions or comments you want to further ask, look, I'm sure Amy will be more than happy to answer any further questions. But if not, thanks everyone for joining us for this afternoon session, and hope you have a great afternoon.
Thanks so much, Sudha.
Thanks, everyone. And before I go quickly, we will have our next webinar on the on the 9th of April. It'll be an international webinar at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time or Daylight Saving Time, whichever one comes first. As you can see, I'm in Perth. Don't quite understand when things change. So watch out for information that's come out. So thanks, everyone. Talk soon. Cheers. Bye.